Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to the mysterious death of Tutankhamun.
The desert night had its own kind of music. If you listen closely, beyond the quiet shifting of sand and the faint sigh of the wind, you could almost hear the pulse of something older, something that had been breathing here for thousands of years. A silver moon hung low over the jagged cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, painting the limestone walls in soft light. Shadows stretched long across the ground, their edges blurred by the warm shimmer rising from the earth. The air smelled faintly of dust and stone, of dryness so deep it seemed eternal.
Somewhere far off, the Nile whispered to itself, winding its patient way north toward the sea. Even here, miles from its banks, you could feel its presence, the way it drew life toward it like a slow, steady heartbeat. The reeds would be rustling now, and in the villages along its edge, oil lamps would be glowing, casting golden halos on mud brick walls. But in the valley, there was only stillness. This was a place where kings slept, their names carved into walls, their treasures locked away for eternity, or so it was meant to be. The cliffs themselves seemed to lean inward, guarding what lay within, as if the land itself were a sentinel. And among these resting rulers, there was one whose story was different. A story both brief and endless, a life that had burned like a small, bright flame before vanishing into shadow. Tutankhamun, the boy who became pharaoh. He had not been born to rule, at least not in the way many of his ancestors had been. His path to the throne was shaped by storms in the royal court, by the collapse of a vision his father had once dared to carve into stone. But on the night the crown touched his head, all of that was still far ahead of him. For now, in this quiet desert place, we begin at the end, because to understand his death, we must first step back into his world. Close your eyes and imagine the Egypt of over 3,000 years ago. The land was alive with color. The green ribbon of the Nile cut through the endless ochre of the desert, its waters shimmering under the sun. Fields of barley and wheat rippled in the breeze. Papyrus flowers lifted their heads toward the sky. Fishermen's boats drifted lazily on the current, nets trailing like silver threads beneath the surface. In the great city of Thebes, temple columns rose like forests of stone, painted in vivid reds, blues, and golds. The air smelt of lotus blossoms and the sharp sweetness of frankincense. Priests in white linen moved through shadowed halls, chanting prayers to the gods whose statues loomed above them. And somewhere beyond the temple walls, in the private gardens of the palace, the young Tutankhamun, not yet king, might have been playing, laughing, or simply watching the ripples of light dance on the water. We will follow him there soon, but for now, linger in this moment, in the hush before his name was carved into history, before his life became a mystery scholars would argue over for centuries. The moon drifts higher, the sand grows cooler beneath your feet, and in the distance, the gates to the city of Thebes open in welcome. Somewhere inside, the story is waiting to be told.
The city of Thebes was already awake when the first light of dawn spilled over the horizon. Morning in Egypt began with the sound of the river, water lapping against stone embankments, boatmen calling to one another as they loosened their ropes, fishermen casting their nets in graceful arcs. From the palace gardens, the Nile was just visible beyond a grove of date palms. The water caught the sunlight in a way that made it look like molten gold, always moving, always alive. In those gardens, shaded by sycamore and tamarisk trees, a boy with dark eyes and a curious mind was beginning his day. Tutankhamun, as he was then called, was no ordinary child. Though at first glance he seemed like any boy his age. He loved games of senet, played on carved wooden boards, the thrill of racing chariots down the palace courtyard, the taste of honey cakes brought warm from the kitchen. But there was always something more in his gaze, a searching, a hunger to understand the world around him. His father, Akhenaten, was a figure both revered and feared. He had changed Egypt in ways no one could have imagined, moving the capital to a new city dedicated to the sun god Aten, and turning the kingdom's gaze away from the many gods to worship only one. It was a vision that had divided the nation, a flame that burned bright and dangerous. And in the quiet moments, when the boy sat by the reflecting pools in the garden, he could feel the weight of it, even if he did not yet understand why. His mother, Queen Nefertiti, if indeed she was his mother, for history's shadows blur such lines, was a figure of grace and strength. She taught him that a ruler must listen more than he speaks, must carry the dreams of his people even when they feel heavy. Sometimes she would sit beside him under the shade of a palm, tracing the hieroglyphs carved into a slab of limestone, telling him stories of the gods, tales of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, of Isis, who stitched together what had been broken, of Horus, whose eye watched over the land. Tutankhamun listened to them all, and in those moments the gods seemed as real as the warm breeze against his cheek. But childhood in the palace was not entirely made of sunlit days and soft breezes. Whispers ran like currents beneath the marble floors, of unrest in the temples, of generals uneasy with Akhenaten's rule, of priests whose power had been stripped away. And when the boy wandered too close to the great audience hall, he could sometimes hear the sharp tones of argument echoing off the stone. He was too young to know then that these tensions would shape his life in ways he could not escape. Too young to see that his own path was being set, one that would lead him to the throne and to the mystery that would follow him for thousands of years. For now, his world was the palace, the scent of lotus blossoms drifting through open windows, the cool touch of polished limestone beneath his feet, the quiet patience of the old tutor who taught him the art of reading the sacred signs. In the evenings, the sky above Thebes would blaze in colors of copper and fire, and he would watch from the balcony as the first stars pricked through the fading light. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the Valley of the Kings, a place he would one day know too well. But that was far ahead. For now, he was only a boy, living in the shadow of a father's vision and a mother's grace, unaware that history was already whispering his name. The years after Tutankhamun's birth unfolded like the shifting sands along the Nile, slowly, yet never still. The great city of Akhetaten, built by his father as a monument to the sun god Aten, stood radiant in the desert light. Its avenues were wide, its temples filled with songs to a single god whose rays reached down to touch the king himself. But for all its beauty, the city held a strange stillness,
as though something in its heart had been pulled too taut. The boy, now old enough to understand more of the conversations that swirled around him, began to notice things. The absence of festivals to the old gods, the way certain servants whispered when they thought no one was listening, the guarded looks between priests when his father's name was spoken.
And then there was the sickness. It came quietly at first, a tiredness in the king's eyes, a faltering step. Tutankhamun saw less of his father and more of the high officials who spoke for him in court. Some said it was the strain of ruling a kingdom in upheaval. Others, more quietly, wondered if the gods his father had cast aside were taking their revenge. It was in these days that Tutankhamun began to dream. Vivid, unsettling visions that seemed to blur the line between waking and sleeping. He would see the great temples of Amun, long abandoned, lit by torches again. He would see a falcon, its wings blackened by shadow, circling over the Valley of the Kings. And sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, he would hear a voice calling his name from somewhere far away, a voice that was both comforting and cold.
His nurse told him these were only dreams, but the old court scribe, a man who had served under 3 kings, muttered something different. Sometimes the gods speak in whispers, and sometimes they speak in shadows. It was not long before the shadows grew darker. Akhenaten, the heretic king, died. How, no one could say with certainty. Some claimed illness, others hinted at poison, and there were those who believed the gods themselves had struck him down. The great city of Akhenaten began to fade almost as soon as its founder was gone. And in the midst of this, the boy, barely 9 years old, was crowned pharaoh.
The priests came to him with their advice, their flattery, their plans. They spoke of restoring the old ways, of bringing back the gods who had been silenced. They urged him to change his name from Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He did as they asked. Whether from his own belief or the weight of the voices around him, no one could say. But from that moment, the whispers began. Whispers that he was a pawn in the hands of those more powerful, that the true rule lay with his advisors, Ai and Horemheb. Yet even at that young age, Tutankhamun carried himself with a quiet dignity. He walked the halls of the palace with the calm of someone who understood that the crown was not just a gift, but a burden, one that had been placed on his head far sooner than he was ready. Still, the dreams came. The falcon in the dark sky, the voice calling his name, and sometimes, faintly, the scent of desert rain, though no storm had passed. Some in the palace would later say that these were omens, that the boy king's fate had been written long before he sat upon the throne. And beyond the walls of Thebes, far out in the desert, the Valley of the Kings waited.
The Valley of the Kings lay west of the Nile, where the living rarely wandered unless they had reason. It was a place of silence and stone, where the cliffs rose like ancient sentinels and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Long before Tutankhamun's time, pharaohs had chosen this valley to hide their tombs from thieves. No towering pyramids here, only hidden doorways carved into the earth meant to guard their journey to the afterlife. But the valley had another name, one whispered only in shadowed corners, the mouth of the serpent. Old laborers told stories of a spirit that moved through its canyons at night, a figure cloaked
in gold dust, with eyes like burning coals. It was said that those who heard its hiss would vanish before the next sunrise, carried away into the underworld before their time. But Tutankhamun had heard these tales as a boy, listening to the old stonecutters speak while they rested in the shade. Back then, the stories had felt like games, harmless warnings to keep children from wandering too far. But now, as pharaoh, he was beginning to wonder if there was truth in the whispers. For even though he lived in Thebes, far from the valley, strange news began to drift toward him. 2 workers missing without trace. A foreman struck blind after a night in the cliffs. A guard who swore he had seen a shadow move against the moonlight, but when he looked again, there was nothing. And yet, preparations for his own tomb had quietly begun. This was custom, of course. Every pharaoh's tomb was carved during his lifetime, but for one so young, the thought felt too close, too heavy.
The chief architect came to him one evening, bowing deeply, and said, "My lord, the western cliffs are ready for your inspection." Tutankhamun hesitated. "I am not yet ready to walk among the dead," he replied. But the words lingered in his mind, echoing through the nights that followed. That was when the dreams began to change. No longer just the falcon, no longer just the voice. Now he saw a narrow passage lit by flickering torches, the air thick with the scent of resin and crushed stone. He would walk down into the earth, deeper and deeper, until the passage opened into a chamber filled with treasures that caught the light like captured stars. And in the center of the chamber, a coffin. His coffin. But the most unsettling part was not that he saw his own burial. It was that the lid of the coffin was slowly beginning to rise. He would wake with a sharp breath, the image still clear as morning light. Some of his priests told him these dreams were visions from the gods, signs that he should prepare himself for a glorious afterlife. Others, less eager to speak, whispered of Heka, the old magic, of curses carved into tomb walls, not to protect treasures, but to bind the dead to the realm of shadows. And always, in the back of his mind, the stories of the mouth of the serpent.
The palace at Thebes was never truly silent. Even in the deepest hours of the night, footsteps echoed faintly down its long corridors, guards on their endless watch, servants carrying water, the distant rustle of palm leaves swaying in the warm breeze. But Tutankhamun began to notice something else. A different kind of sound, a whisper just at the edge of hearing, not in the air around him, but in the space between his thoughts. It began after a meeting of his council. The vizier, had been advising more and more strongly that the young pharaoh should lead a ceremonial procession into the Valley of the Kings, a symbolic gesture to honor his ancestors and the gods of the West. Tutankhamun had smiled politely, promising to consider it, but inside, unease coiled like a snake. He knew the valley was no place for the living without cause. Still, Ai's voice was persuasive, warm, reasonable, the voice of a man who had guided him since childhood. That night, the whisper returned. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the words were too clear. "They prepare your path, Neb-Keper-Rul, not to rule, but to rest."
He sat upright in bed, the shadows in the corners of the room pressing closer. "Who speaks?" he whispered into the dark. There was no answer, only the faint scent of incense, and something else, faint and metallic, like old blood. In the days that followed, he began to see patterns where none should be. A scribe who always lingered outside the council chamber after meetings. A physician who asked too often about his health, even when he felt well. Letters sealed with I's mark, sent to distant outposts for reasons never explained. And yet, to anyone else, the palace life went on as usual. The laughter of servants, the splash of fountains, the scent of honeyed bread in the mornings. It was his queen, Tutankhamun, who finally spoke of it aloud. They were walking through the palace gardens, the lotus flowers floating still and pale in the reflecting pools. "My husband, you must be careful whom you trust. Not all who bow before you wish for your reign to be long." Tutankhamun looked at her, the late sunlight gilding her face. "Do you speak of I?" She hesitated, just long enough for him to have his answer. The rest of the walk was quiet, but that night the whisper returned, stronger than before. "The serpent coils in your court, Pharaoh, and its strike will come before the next flood."
The morning of the procession came wrapped in gold light. The sun, still low over the horizon, painted the Theban hills in shades of ochre and rose. The air smelled of desert stone warming under its first touch of day. Tutankhamun stood on the palace steps, dressed in a shimmering linen tunic, the crook and flail crossed over his chest. Servants moved quietly around him, fastening his gilded pectoral and adjusting the cobra-shaped uraeus upon his brow. To any watching, he was every inch the living god of Egypt. But inside, the unease from the past weeks had not left him. It clung to him like the faint taste of smoke after a fire. The Valley of the Kings lay west of the Nile, beyond the cultivated green, into the barren cliffs where no crops grew and no songs were sung. It was the realm of the silent, where the dead pharaohs slept under mountains of stone. The vizier Ai was at his side, his voice smooth as papyrus over water. "My pharaoh," he said, "this day will be remembered by the gods themselves. You walk among your ancestors, and they will grant you their wisdom." Tutankhamun only nodded. The whisper had not come last night, and somehow he wished it had. Silence felt heavier now. The procession began with the slow beat of drums. Priests in leopard skins carried censers, sending up curls of sweet myrrh into the morning air. The people lined the route through Thebes, throwing petals into the path, chanting prayers as the young king's chariot rolled by. Tutankhamun rode just behind him, her face calm, but her eyes never leaving him. By midday, they reached the river. The royal barge waited, painted in gold and lapis, its prow carved into the head of a falcon. As they crossed the Nile, the green fields gave way to the first whispers of the desert. Hot wind, bare rock, the cry of a lone kite overhead. The valley appeared slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself. It was not a place of grandeur, but of weight. Narrow cliffs rising on both sides, their surfaces scarred by ancient tomb entrances. Here lay kings who had ruled for centuries past, their names still whispered in temple prayers. But Tutankhamun felt something. The air was dry, yet thick, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. I guided him toward a carved stone platform where priests awaited with offerings, bread, beer, cuts of meat for the ka of the ancestors.
Incantations were spoken in the old tongue, calling on Osiris to bless the reign of the living king. It was during the final prayer that Tutankhamun saw it. High on the cliff, half hidden in shadow, a figure watched. Too far to know the face, but the stance was still, deliberate. The whisper returned, but this time it was not in his mind alone. It came on the wind, low enough that only he seemed to hear it. The valley does not give back the living. A sudden gust sent sand spiraling around his feet, stinging his skin. When he looked again, the figure on the cliff was gone.
The sun was sinking low over the western horizon, casting the Nile in molten gold. In the palace at Memphis, Tutankhamun sat alone in the garden court, the warm evening air thick with the scent of lotus blossoms. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city murmured with the quiet bustle of life. Traders closing their stalls, women returning from the river with jars balanced on their heads, the faint beat of a distant drum marking the end of the day. But inside the court, the air felt different, still, expectant. He had been ill for days, though he tried to hide it from his attendants. A lingering ache in his leg, the one weakened from birth, had worsened, and a fever had taken root. Even now, a sheen of sweat clung to his brow despite the cooling breeze. His gaze wandered toward the western sky, where the disk of the sun dipped closer to the horizon. To the Egyptians, the West was the land of the dead, where Ra sailed into the underworld each night to battle the serpent Apophis, before rising again.
The high priest of Amun had once told him of a prophecy. If the sun bleeds red upon the river, and the birds cross in silence, the pharaoh will soon journey west. Tutankhamun had laughed at the time, but tonight the words came back to him with quiet insistence. The birds passed without a single cry. A servant approached, bowing deeply. "Your Majesty, the evening meal is ready." Tutankhamun did not answer immediately. He let his eyes rest on the far line of the horizon, where the last of the light quivered and broke apart into shadows. Then, softly, almost to himself, he whispered, "Perhaps it is time." That night, as the palace settled into sleep, the young pharaoh dreamed. He stood in a vast desert, the stars blazing overhead. A figure emerged from the dunes, tall, robed in deep indigo, the face hidden by a mask of gold shaped like a jackal's head. In one hand, the figure held an ankh, in the other, a staff topped with the wasp scepter. The voice that spoke was neither loud nor soft, but it seemed to fill the entire desert. "Tutankhamun, son of the sun, your time in this form wanes. You have walked the earth as ruler, but now you will sail with Ra through the hidden ways." The young king tried to speak, to ask if he could remain, if Egypt still needed him, but the figure only turned, pointing toward the far west where the first light of dawn touched the sand. When Tutankhamun awoke, his body felt heavier, as if part of him had already begun to follow that figure into the darkness.
The palace at Memphis had always been a place of ritual precision. Servants moved like shadows, their bare feet making no sound on the polished floors. Scribes bent over scrolls in quiet alcoves,
the gentle scratching of reed pens the only sign of their work. But in the days following the king's strange dream, there was a different kind of movement. A sense of murmurs that stopped when one entered a room, of glances traded in corners, of the air shifting when certain names were spoken. Tutankhamun, weakened though he was, noticed. He heard faint voices in the corridors at night, speaking quickly in tones that carried urgency but no warmth. He could not catch the words, only the rhythm, like waves striking stone. Aya, his vizier, was often at the center of these movements. Aya was a man of quiet power, his loyalty publicly unquestioned. But the young pharaoh had begun to wonder how many of Aya's decisions were made for Egypt and how many for Aya himself. One evening, as the moon hung low over the river, Tutankhamun left his chambers and walked the cool hallway toward the audience court. His leg throbbed with each step, but he moved without attendants, leaning lightly on an ebony walking staff. He paused near one of the great columns. From beyond the carved stone, voices whispered. His strength fades, we must be ready. The gods will bless the one who keeps the kingdom steady. Before the flood season, it must be done. The voices shifted, footsteps approaching. Tutankhamun melted back into the shadows, the column hiding him from sight. Aya and General Horemheb passed, speaking in low tones. He caught only one more phrase before they vanished into the court. Before the West takes him. That night the pharaoh lay awake, listening to the wind in the palm fronds outside his window. The walls seemed to breathe with old stories, of kings who ruled with fire, of queens who ruled with guile, of those who had not died by accident. He thought of the ibis flight at sunset, the figure in his dream, the quiet power gathering just beyond his reach, and for the first time he wondered if his death might not come from illness alone.
The sun over Memphis was pale the morning she arrived. She came not in a royal barge, but in a simple reed boat, pulled by two men in plain linen. Her name, the attendant said, was Neferet, a priestess of Sekhmet from Thebes, called by the queen herself to tend to the king's failing health. She was tall, her hair bound in a single braid, her eyes the shade of river silt after rain. The gold necklace she wore was shaped like a lion's head, the mouth open as if mid-roar. Tutankhamun has heard of her before, whispered tales that she could cure the fever that even physicians feared, or banish a restless spirit from a man's shadow. That evening she came to his chamber. The lamps were low, the air rich with the scent of lotus resin and honeyed oil. She knelt beside him, her bracelets chiming softly. "You are troubled, my king," she said, her voice deep and unhurried, "by more than sickness." Tutankhamun studied her. There was no court flattery in her tone, only certainty. He said nothing at first, but she began her work. She placed her hands over his chest, not touching, and began to chant in a language older than the pyramids. The sound was low, a vibration that seemed to travel into the bones. From a small bronze bowl, she lifted a mixture of ground myrrh, crushed date pits, and powdered turquoise. She dabbed it across his forehead in 3 lines. "These are for protection," she murmured. "Not from fever, from those who would see your ka drift from your body before its time." Her eyes met his then, and he felt as if she had spoken the thought he had not dared to voice. In the nights that followed, Neferet remained at the palace. She brewed dark, bitter teas,
burned incense that filled the corridors, and left amulets of carved carnelian in the corners of his chamber. Some of the physicians scoffed quietly at her methods, but Tutankhamun's strength seemed to steady, not return fully, but no longer slip so quickly away. Yet the whispers in the palace did not fade. If anything, they grew sharper, quieter still, as though Neferet's presence had unsettled more than just illness. One night, while the moon was thin as a sickle, Neferet leaned close to the king and whispered, "There are those who wait for the Nile to rise, thinking it will wash away their guilt. But the river remembers, my king, and so must you."
The air was heavy that night, warm and still, as if even the desert had paused to listen. Tutankhamun could not sleep. The dreams had been strange for weeks. Visions of a dark bird circling over the palace, its wings casting shadows that swallowed the sun. He rose from his bed, slipping into a robe of fine linen, and stepped out onto the balcony. Below, the palace gardens glimmered faintly in the moonlight, palms swaying, the pools reflecting thin silver lines. It was then he saw it. The ibis. Its feathers were black as bitumen, absorbing the moonlight. It stood upon the edge of the reflecting pool, still as carved obsidian. The bird's eyes caught the light, not with the yellow of a predator, but with a strange greenish gleam, like river water deep in shadow. From behind him a voice spoke. "The ibis is sacred to Thuth, Lord of Wisdom, but this one brings no blessing." It was Neferet. She moved to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the bird. "When the ibis comes in darkness," she murmured, "it is not the scribe's pen it carries, but the tally of souls the gods are ready to weigh." Tutankhamun frowned. "It is only a bird," he said, though his words sounded uncertain even to him. But the ibis turned its head then, and he swore he saw a faint ripple move through the water, as if the reflection were not of the garden, but of something else entirely, something vast and shifting. That same night, a servant collapsed in the kitchens, his body fever-hot, his breath ragged. By dawn, 2 more had taken ill. The palace physicians called it a passing sickness from the river fish, but Neferet said nothing, only placed another amulet at the foot of the king's bed. In the days that followed, the ibis appeared again and again on the roofline by the palace gates, once even on the arm of a statue of Horus in the temple court. Wherever it came, the air seemed colder, the shadows deeper. On the 7th night, Tutankhamun dreamed again, this time of standing on a narrow bridge of black stone, the Nile below churning with currents of blood. On the far bank, the ibis waited, and behind it, a figure in a gold death mask, face hidden, arms outstretched. When he woke, the first thing he heard was the sound of the bird's cry echoing across the palace walls.
Ankhesenamun had always known the palace was full of whispers, but lately they followed her like shadows. Servants' eyes darted away when she passed. Messages arrived without seals, only half-formed warnings. The north winds bring change. She knew what it meant. Someone was moving against the king, and perhaps against her as well. On the night after the ibis's 7th appearance, she summoned Horemheb, commander of the army, to her private chamber. The meeting itself was dangerous, for the walls of the palace were not just stone, but ears. "Horemheb," she said quietly, "there are those who think the boy king is weak, that the gods no longer favor him." Horemheb's eyes narrowed. "And you? What do you think?" She hesitated only a moment. "I think strength is not in age or the number of soldiers,
but in those who survive long enough to rule, and I intend for him to survive." The commander stepped closer, his voice low. "Then you must let me act. There are priests who would see Tutankhamun gone, high scribes who would replace him with one more compliant. And you?" she asked, her gaze sharp. "I serve Egypt," he said, though the way his mouth tightened made her wonder whose Egypt he meant. That same week, Ankhesenamun made a more dangerous move. Under the cover of night, she sent a sealed letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's sworn enemy. The message was bold, desperate. "My husband is dead. I have no son. They say I must marry a servant. I will not. Send me one of your sons, and I will make him Pharaoh." It was a gamble, one that could unite empires or destroy her completely. For the truth was, Tutankhamun still lived, but his health was failing, and she could feel the trap of the court closing in on her. When she returned to his chambers, he was asleep, his breathing uneven. She placed her hand on his, and for a moment the queen and the boy she had known since childhood were just two souls in the flicker of the lamplight. She whispered, "Hold on, Tut, just a little longer." But outside, beyond the guarded doors, the black ibis stood again on the palace wall, its head tilted toward the king's window.
The festival of Opet filled Thebes with music, incense, and the glow of oil lamps. From the palace balcony, Tutankhamun could hear the chants of priests carrying Amun's statue down the avenue, the sound echoing between columns like a heartbeat. He had been feeling better that morning, enough to sit upright on the throne during the ceremonies, but by evening exhaustion settled on him like a heavy cloak. Ankhesenamun insisted they retire to their private chambers, away from the noise. In the quiet, a servant entered with a tray of pomegranate wine. It was Tutankhamun's favorite, a rare luxury brought from the orchards near the delta. The servant poured 2 cups, bowing low. The king lifted his, but before he could drink, Ankhesenamun touched his arm. "Wait," she said softly. She took the other cup and sipped first, accustomed between them to ease his fears after months of rumors about plots. Her lips touched the wine, and she froze. There was an aftertaste, faint, bitter, metallic. She set the cup down and looked at her husband. "Not this one," she said, replacing it with the untouched cup. He frowned, but obeyed. When the servant left, she poured the first cup into a shallow bronze bowl and set it near the fire. The scent of the wine mingled with something acrid as it warmed. She had smelled it once before, in the herbal storerooms, in jars labeled hemlock and mandrake. That night, Ankhesenamun could not sleep. Somewhere in the palace, the conspirators were moving, confident their attempt had gone unnoticed. But now she knew. The attack would not stop. Tutankhamun was a king marked for death. The question was not if, but when. And outside, when she looked from her window, the black ibis was gone. In its place, the moon hung over the Nile, pale and thin as a blade.
The mask had been brought out only once before in Tutankhamun's reign, on the night of his coronation, when the priests of Amun declared him the living Horus. It was said to be older than the dynasty itself, fashioned in a forgotten age when gods walked beside men.
Made of pure gold, inlaid with lapis and obsidian, it was believed to carry a heka, a divine enchantment that could shield its wearer from all harm, so long as their heart remained pure. The mask's eyes seemed to follow whoever stood before it, catching the lamplight like molten suns. Ankhesenamun had the mask brought to their private shrine, against the advice of the court priests. They whispered that such relics were not to be disturbed, lest the magic within turn against the one who sought to control it. But the queen was desperate. She knelt before the mask in the flickering shadows, speaking words she had half learned from the temple chants, half remembered from her mother's old stories. She asked for the god's protection over her husband, for the mask to be a wall against poison, blades, and betrayal. That night, Tutankhamun dreamed of standing in a vast desert beneath a sky split with fire. A tall figure approached, a man with the head of a falcon, eyes bright as the morning star. "You will be remembered," the god said, "but not for the years you live." The sand began to rise, swirling around his legs, pulling him down. From somewhere far away, Ankhesenamun's voice called his name, and the vision broke. When he awoke, the mask was still there on the altar, but something had changed. The gold seemed darker, almost bruised, and a fine crack ran from the left eyebrow to the cheek. The priests would later insist no such crack had ever been there before. Some said it was a warning from the gods. Others claimed it was the first sign that the curse had been awakened.
The night air over Thebes was thick with the smell of the river, heavy and damp. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal's cry split the silence, long, low, and hollow. It was the kind of sound that made the palace guards glance over their shoulders. In the temples, jackals were sacred to Anubis, guardian of the dead. But in the streets, they were feared as omens. And in the palace that night, the sound carried a particular weight. Ankhesenamun awoke to find the lamps flickering, their flames guttering as though some unseen wind had passed. Tutankhamun was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, staring at the doorway. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. Before she could answer, the cry came again, closer this time. Then a shadow moved across the courtyard, low and quick, the unmistakable shape of a jackal. The palace guards swore they had not opened the gates, and yet the animal prowled the inner gardens, unafraid, its eyes catching the torchlight like drops of molten gold. Some said it was a creature of flesh and blood. Others that it was a spirit sent to collect a soul before its appointed time. That night, Tutankhamun dreamed again, but this time there was no desert, no godly messenger. Only the jackal, standing on a blackened road, its gaze fixed on him. It turned, and when it did, the world around them shifted into the dark holes of a tomb, walls carved with his own name. When he reached for the animal, his hand passed through it, and his fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of stone. The air smelled of myrrh and death. By morning, the jackal was gone, but a scribe who had served the boy king for years was found dead in his chambers, no wound upon him, as if he had simply stopped breathing in his sleep. The priests whispered that the jackal had taken the wrong soul for now.
The Nile was in flood, spilling its silver waters across the fields. It was meant to be a season of renewal, when fish swarmed in the shallows and the air buzzed with life. But for Tutankhamun, the river's rise brought a different call. the call to hunt. He had always loved the chase, whether it was ducks in the papyrus thickets, gazelles in the open plain, or the wild desert ox. The hunt had been his escape from the suffocating walls of the palace. And now, as though to prove to his court that the jackal's visit had not unsettled him, the young king declared that he would ride out into the desert to hunt with his chariot team. The day began hot, the sun a burnished disk above the shifting dunes. Tutankhamun's horses were restless, snorting clouds of dust, their hooves striking sparks against the hard earth. And Khazenaman had begged him to take more guards, but he waved her off. "He will not live in fear of shadows," he said, his voice sharper than usual. The chariot wheels cut deep lines in the sand as he pursued a stag that had strayed far from the marshes. His laughter echoed across the barren hills, a sound of youth, of defiance. But then, as the stag leapt across a dry ravine, one of the chariot wheels struck a buried stone. The vehicle lurched violently. Witnesses later claimed they saw the king thrown forward, the reins still clutched in his hands, his body striking the horses before he fell beneath them. The animals screamed and reared, and in the chaos, the chariot toppled. When his men reached him, Tutankhamun was conscious but pale, a deep bruise already darkening along his hip and thigh. He insisted they return to the palace immediately. By the time they arrived, the bruise had spread, swelling until it looked as if the skin itself were struggling to contain what lay beneath. The physicians worked through the night, but the injury refused to heal. Some said the wound festered. Others whispered that it was no ordinary wound at all, that the jackal's curse had marked him, and no human hand could undo it.
The desert heat clung to Thebes even after nightfall, but inside the palace, the air was stifling for a different reason. Tutankhamun lay upon a couch in his private chambers, the golden head of the goddess Sekhmet looming over him from the carved bed frame, her lion's eyes fixed on his restless form. His injury had darkened to a deep purple, the skin hot to the touch. At first, he had laughed off the pain, insisting it was nothing a few days' rest could not mend. But by the 5th night, his laughter was gone, replaced by shivering fits and fevered murmurs. The royal physicians worked in tense silence. They ground frankincense into a paste, pressed lotus-soaked cloths against his brow, and poured bitter herbal infusions between his lips. Yet the fever only climbed higher. Ankhesenamun kept watch beside him, her own eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. Sometimes, when the fever broke for a moment, he would reach for her hand and whisper half-coherent things about a great darkness in the desert, about a voice that called him son of the sun, and about a shadowed figure with the head of a jackal standing at the foot of his bed. On the 6th night, a sandstorm swept in from the west, rattling the palace shutters and driving fine dust into every crack. The priests took it as a bad omen. The high priest of Amun was summoned, his robes dusted with gold powder, and he performed a midnight ritual at the king's bedside. He invoked the protection of Horus, the healing cower of Isis, and the mercy of Osiris. But as the incense smoke curled toward the ceiling, Tutankhamun's body arched in pain, his breath ragged. Some swore they saw the golden mask of Sekhmet above the bed shimmer in the torchlight, and for an instant her mouth curved in something that was not a smile.
The palace of Akhetaten glowed under the soft light of the late afternoon sun, its white limestone walls casting long shadows across the wide courtyards. Servants hurried silently along the colonnades, their eyes lowered, while scribes bent over papyrus scrolls in shaded corners. The air was warm, but carried the faint scent of lotus from the pools, mingling with the dust of the desert. Tutankhamun sat in the audience hall, the great carved pillars towering above him like a forest of stone. His throne was inlaid with gold and lapis, the arms shaped like lions crouched in readiness. But the young pharaoh seemed almost swallowed by its size, his thin frame draped in silks that shimmered with every movement. His crown, the blue keprish of war, weighed heavily on his brow. Before him stood the elders of his court, I, the wizened Grand Vizier, with eyes that hid more than they revealed. Horemheb, the general whose armor gleamed even in the dim light, and Maya, the treasurer, whose calm presence was like a stone in the river's flow. They had been summoned to hear Tutankhamun's decree. The whispers in the palace suggested it might be his last formal audience. "My friends," Tutankhamun began, his voice steady but soft, "Egypt stands at a crossroads. The gods have been patient with us, though we have tested them with division and doubt. The temples must be restored, the people united." I nodded gravely. "Your words honor the gods, my pharaoh, and yet the treasury runs thin. The grain from the delta is slow to arrive. War to the north drains our coffers." The young pharaoh leaned forward, his young face sharpened by determination. "Peace will fill the storehouses faster than war. We must rebuild what my father abandoned." At the mention of Akhenaten, a shadow crossed the room. The memory of the heretic pharaoh was still a wound, he who had cast down the old gods for the Aten. Tutankhamun had worked tirelessly to reverse those changes, restoring Amun and the temples of Karnak and Luxor. Yet the scars of that upheaval lingered. Horemheb stepped forward, his voice edged with steel. "Peace is a noble aim, my king, but our enemies see youth as weakness. The Hittites test our borders. We must be ready to answer." The boy king's eyes flickered toward Horemheb. "We will be ready, but strength is more than the spear. It is the hand that feeds, the walls that protect, the prayers that please the gods." There was a silence for a long moment. Outside, the faint sound of a temple sistrum carried on the wind. I broke the stillness with a slow bow. "As you command, Nebuchadnezzar Tutankhamun, living image of Amun." The meeting ended with ritual farewells, the courtiers bowing low before their pharaoh. But as they departed, each man's gaze lingered on the boy on the throne, as though measuring his time. Tutankhamun watched them go, his fingers gripping the arms of the lions. In his heart, he felt the weight of something unseen, a tide moving against him. That night, as the last light faded from the horizon, Tutankhamun remained alone in the hall. The golden faces of the gods looked down from the walls, silent and watchful. Somewhere deep inside, he knew. The days ahead would demand more than words or decrees. And perhaps they would be his last.
The moon rose pale and round over the desert, a silver coin in the darkening sky. The air was still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In the palace at Akhenaten, torches flickered along the walls, their flames bending without wind, casting shifting patterns across painted scenes of gods and pharaohs. Tutankhamun lay in his private chamber, the cool linen sheets drawn to his chest. Sleep would not come. His body ached in familiar ways. His leg throbbed with the deep pulsing pain he had known since childhood. But tonight, something deeper unsettled him. He had dreamt of the Nile running black, its surface choked with lotus blossoms, and of a falcon with eyes like the stars of the Duat. A knock sounded at the door. It was soft, hesitant. "Enter," he called. The door opened, and Ankhesenamun stepped into the lamplight. She was wrapped in a sheer white robe, her hair braided with strands of gold. Her expression was troubled. "There is talk among the priests," she said without preamble. "They say the moon will darken tonight. An eclipse." Tutankhamun sat up slowly, wincing at the pull in his back. The priests have seen many eclipses. The moon passes, the sun returns. The gods keep their balance. But Ankhesenamun shook her head. "This is no ordinary omen. The high priest of Amun says the shadow will come at the very hour the moon reaches its highest point. It is a sign." He smiled faintly, though there was little humor in it. The gods are fond of signs. Still, when she left, Tutankhamun rose and wrapped himself in a simple cloak. He walked alone to the roof of the palace, the sandstone cool beneath his bare feet. From there, the view stretched across the city to the desert beyond. He stood watching as the moon climbed higher, gleaming over the pylons and obelisks. And then, without warning, a shadow began to bite into its edge. Slowly, impossibly, the silver disk darkened, swallowed by a creeping blackness. The city below grew dim, the torches flickering like small, defiant stars. From the temples came the low sound of chanting. The priests' voices rose in a rhythmic plea to Thoth, Lord of the Moon, to restore the light. Drums beat in slow, steady measure, echoing against the cliffs. And then he felt it. The air thickened, heavy with something unseen. A coldness touched his skin, though no wind stirred. He glanced toward the western horizon, and for a heartbeat swore he saw a figure there, standing against the dying light. Tall, cloaked, the face hidden beneath a jackal-headed mask. Anubis. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in command. Tutankhamun's breath caught, his pulse quickened. And then, as if the vision had been no more than a trick of the night, the shape was gone. The shadow passed. The moon returned, pale and whole, once more. But the cold in his bones did not leave. He descended from the roof in silence, and when he lay down again, he whispered into the darkness, as if to someone listening far away, "I am not ready."
Night fell over the Valley of the Kings, and the stars stretched across the desert sky like ancient jewels scattered upon black silk. The wind moved in low sighs between the cliffs, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and stone that had not seen sunlight for thousands of years. In the deep hours, when even the desert jackals had ceased their cries, some said the valley spoke. A soft murmur, too faint to be wind alone, could be heard in the hollows between tombs, a tapestry of whispers in languages long forgotten. Archaeologists dismissed it as superstition, the result of air shifting through fissures in the rock. But for the villagers of Kurna, who lived in mud-brick houses on the edge of the valley, it was the breath of the dead, and it was not to be disturbed. It was into this silence that Howard Carter walked, lantern in hand, on the night before the final clearance of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. He was alone, or at least that was how it appeared. Shadows clung to the walls of the cliffs, stretching and swaying in the lantern's glow, making the air feel thicker, heavier. Carter stopped in front of the sealed doorway, the one that bore the cartouche of the boy king. He thought of the years he had searched, the endless seasons of dust and disappointment, and now he stood at the threshold of history. But as he reached to brush the seal with his fingertips, the flame in his lantern wavered, and the sound came, faint at first, then unmistakable. "Do not wake what sleeps." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was as if the desert itself had spoken. Carter's breath caught, but he shook his head. He was tired. His mind was playing tricks. Still, he found himself murmuring to the empty air, "I'm not here to wake him, only to see." And yet, somewhere in the valley's shadows, the whisper came again, softer this time, almost like a sigh. "You cannot see without changing what you find."
The chamber was still, save for the faint echo of breath against ancient walls. Howard Carter stood before the golden shrine within the burial chamber, his lantern casting a warm glow over its surface. Every inch was adorned with protective inscriptions and scenes from the Book of the Dead, guardians meant to ward off intruders. It had taken weeks to reach this moment. Weeks of removing shrines, layers of linen-wrapped relics and seals that had not been broken for over 3,000 years. The air that escaped when the final panel was pried open was thick and dry, carrying with it the faint, almost sweet scent of ancient resins. Inside, the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun gleamed softly, its carved surface worn smooth by time. Carter's team moved with deliberate care, lifting away the heavy lid. Beneath it lay not one, but 3 nested coffins, each more intricate than the last. The innermost coffin, made entirely of solid gold, cradled the mummy of the young king. His face was hidden behind the iconic burial mask, a masterpiece of gold and lapis lazuli. In the lantern light, it seemed almost alive, the almond-shaped eyes watching them with an eternal, unreadable calm. Yet something was strange. As they examined the remains, they found the body was unusually charred, as if burned from within. The linen wrappings were blackened, brittle, fused to the flesh in some places. This was not the expected state of a royal burial. Whispers filled the room. Some spoke of a botched embalming, others of a deliberate act to destroy the king's body. And there in that dim chamber, with the air heavy and unmoving, more than one man felt the unsettling sense that they were not alone. Above them, the flicker of lantern light made the painted gods on the walls seem to shift, watching, waiting. The mystery deepened.
The blackened wrappings of Tutankhamun's body puzzled every expert who looked upon them. In most royal burials, linen bindings were pristine, scented with costly resins, meant to preserve the body for eternity. But here, the linen had been scorched. Tests decades later would reveal traces of flammable oils and an unusual chemical composition. The conclusion was unsettling. The body had likely burned inside the coffin after burial. How could such a thing happen? One theory suggested the embalmers had used an excess of oil in the funerary rites, perhaps in haste. Combined with the natural heat of decomposition and the sealed tomb, a slow, smoldering combustion might have occurred, consuming the wrappings from within. But to others, it was no accident. In the shadowed corners of the burial chamber, Carter's team exchanged theories they dared not write down. Some said the fire was a final act of vengeance, meant to rob the young pharaoh of a perfect afterlife. Ancient Egyptians believed that damaging the body could sever the soul's journey. A burned corpse was a mutilation not just of flesh, but of spirit. And so the question emerged: had Tutankhamun been cursed not after death, but in death itself? Had his enemies ensured that, even in eternity, he would wander restless? It was a thought Carter tried to push away. But as the golden mask was lifted from the boy's face, revealing the fragile features beneath, he could not shake the feeling that someone, or something,
had tried to erase this king from both history and the afterlife. When the bandages were carefully peeled away from Tutankhamun's skull, another mystery emerged: a fracture at the base of his head. Some argued it was the mark of a violent blow, a sign of assassination. Others insisted it could have happened after death, during the hurried embalming. The fracture, however, seemed too clean, too deliberate. In Egyptian court life, political murder was no stranger. A sudden illness could remove a ruler without public scandal. A wound concealed beneath golden funerary masks might erase all suspicion. If the young pharaoh had indeed been struck down, the question was, by whom? I, the elderly vizier who became king after Tutankhamun's death, was a likely suspect. He had the motive, power, and the opportunity. He had also conducted the boy's burial himself, perhaps overseeing the rushed and flawed embalming. But there were others. Military leaders who resented Tutankhamun's reversal of his father Akhenaten's radical religious reforms. Priests who feared instability. Even members of the royal family who might have seen the boy king as an obstacle. And yet the fracture alone was not proof. The sands of time had a way of turning certainty into dust. Still, as the light from the archaeologists' lamps glinted off the smooth, ancient bone, it was hard to imagine the final moment: a quiet chamber, a trusted hand, and the sudden strike that silenced Egypt's ruler forever.
In the weeks following Tutankhamun's death, Egypt's palace halls were said to echo with whispers. Not the grief of a nation, but the quiet murmur of a carefully managed transition. I ascended the throne swiftly, marrying Enkhsinnammun, Tutankhamun's widow, to legitimize his claim. But she, too, seemed wary of the court's designs. A surviving letter, the infamous Dakamunzu correspondence, suggests she may have written to the Hittite king, begging him to send a prince to become her husband, for "I will not take a servant of mine and make him my husband." If true, it was a dangerous plea. Foreign princes rarely entered Egypt without blood being spilled. The Hittite prince who answered her call was murdered before reaching the Nile. The queen disappears from the records soon after. Whether she was forced into marriage with Ai, exiled, or worse, no one can say. Her fate remains as shadowed as her husband's.
In myth, sudden death without proper rites was dangerous. The soul could wander, unanchored, unable to cross into the field of reeds, the eternal paradise. Some priests whispered that Tutankhamun's Ka, his life force, had not been appeased. They claimed strange dreams visited the people of Thebes, dreams of a young king standing at the edge of the desert, his eyes hollow, his voice calling for justice. One legend tells of a storm that struck the Valley of the Kings not long after his burial, fierce enough to wash away paths and fill tomb entrances with sand. The locals called it the Wrath of the Boy King. It is perhaps no coincidence that A's reign was short-lived. The gods, it seemed, had not forgotten. Modern science would bring new layers to the mystery. CT scans of Tutankhamun's remains revealed that parts of his body had been burned after burial, not by flame, but by a chemical reaction between his embalming oils and exposure to high heat. This suggested a burial so rushed, so improperly handled, that the pharaoh's own remains had essentially cooked in his coffin. Why would Egypt's most sacred ritual be botched so badly? Was it incompetence born of panic?
Or was it deliberate, a final act to destroy his body, and with it, his eternal spirit? The thought lingers like smoke in the tomb air.
When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, newspapers exploded with tales of a pharaoh's curse after several members of the expedition died under mysterious circumstances. In truth, Carter himself lived another 17 years, but the myth stuck. People loved the idea that the boy king had reached across millennia to punish those who disturbed him. Some said this was justice, that Tutankhamun had been wronged in life and would tolerate no further insult in death. Others saw it differently. Perhaps his Ka, trapped and restless, had simply lashed out at the living, seeking a path to peace. Today, scholars still argue. Was Tutankhamun murdered with a blow to the head? Did he die from a chariot accident, shattering his body? Or was he undone by illness, his injuries only the result of a lifetime of frailty? The truth may never be known. The ancient Nile has carried too many secrets into the deep. But perhaps that's fitting. Pharaohs lived surrounded by mystery, their lives as much myth as fact. And Tutankhamun, the boy who became a god, has ensured that his final story will never truly end. If you visit his tomb today, deep in the Valley of the Kings, the air is still and heavy. His painted walls glow softly in the lamplight, images of him welcomed by Osiris, embraced by Anubis. His journey into the afterlife forever frozen in ochre and gold. Some visitors claim to feel watched, as if the boy king lingers in the space between torchlight and shadow. Perhaps he is still waiting for the truth to be spoken aloud. And maybe, somewhere, in the halls of the gods, Tutankhamun walks beside the Nile of eternity, a quiet smile on his lips, knowing that in death he achieved what few rulers ever could, to be remembered forever.